The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as James moved between tables, refilling cups and clearing empty plates. It was another ordinary evening at the small diner where he had worked for the past 5 years. The place wasn't fancy, but it had a warmth to it, the kind that made regular customers feel at home. He had seen all kinds of people walk through the doors. Some came for a quick meal, others stayed for hours, lost in their own thoughts. But the woman who had rolled in that evening was different. James noticed her the moment she entered. She was in a wheelchair, her frail hands gripping the armrests tightly. Wrinkles lined her face, and her silver hair was pulled back neatly. A deep sadness clung to her, as if she carried the weight of something far greater than time. She wheeled herself to a corner table and placed a small, brown leather bag on her lap. James walked over with his usual warm smile. "Good evening, ma'am. What can I get for you?" She looked up, her eyes scanning his face, as if searching for something. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out at first. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, she said, "Tea. Just tea." James nodded and turned away, but the feeling of her gaze lingered. He shook off the unease, blaming it on exhaustion. It had been a long shift. A few minutes later, he placed a steaming cup of tea in front of her. "Here you go, ma'am." The woman didn't reach for the cup. Instead, she opened her bag and pulled out a small, folded newspaper clipping. Her hands trembled as she smoothed it on the table and pushed it toward him. "Read this," she said. James hesitated. Something about her tone made the air feel heavier. The diner around them buzzed with life, couples chatting, forks clinking against plates, the distant hum of a song playing from the jukebox. But in that moment, everything seemed distant. Slowly, he reached for the paper. It was old, the edges yellowed and brittle. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the faded ink. And then he saw it. Unsolved mystery, boy disappears after tragic accident, no body found. His chest tightened. His fingers gripped the paper as his breath grew shallow. This wasn't just any news article. It was about him. 15 years ago. A storm had raged that night. Lightning slashed across the sky as rain poured in thick sheets, turning the streets into rivers. 11-year-old James had been in the back seat of his father's car, his little hands gripping the seatbelt tightly as his mother's voice rose in panic. "Slow down, Daniel. We can barely see the road." "I know what I'm doing," his father snapped, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The wind howled outside. The tires skidded on the wet pavement as the car rounded a curve. Then, out of nowhere, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness. A truck. Too close. Too fast. James's mother screamed. The impact came with a deafening crash. Metal twisted. Glass shattered. The world flipped. And then, silence. James had woken up to the sound of rain tapping against something hollow. His head throbbed. Blood trickled down his forehead, warm and sticky. He was upside down. The car had landed in a ditch. His parents. His stomach lurched. He twisted, trying to see. His mother's lifeless eyes stared back at him, her face pale. His father lay motionless beside her. Panic surged through him. He needed to get out. His fingers fumbled with the seatbelt, his small body trembling. It finally gave way, and he dropped onto the ceiling of the overturned car. He crawled through the broken window, his palms scraping against glass and metal. The rain poured harder. His vision blurred. His legs felt weak. Then, footsteps. Not just one set. Several. Dark figures emerged through the rain, their silhouettes barely visible. James tried to call for help, but his voice came out as a strangled whisper. One of them bent down, staring at him. Then, darkness. When he woke up, he was in a hospital bed, his head bandaged. A nurse sat beside him. "Sweetheart, what's your name?" she asked gently. James had opened his mouth, but no words came. He didn't know. His mind was blank. No name. No memory. Nothing. The accident had erased everything. And for years, he had lived with only fragments of that night, flashes of rain, headlights, a feeling of fear. Until now. Back to the present. James stared at the newspaper clipping, his pulse pounding. The article detailed the crash, describing how a young boy had gone missing after the accident. His parents had died on impact, but the child, James, had vanished without a trace. The police had searched for weeks. No body was ever found. The case had remained open for years before eventually being labeled a mystery. His hands trembled. He looked up at the woman in the wheelchair, his throat dry. Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The woman exhaled slowly. "I've been searching for you for 15 years, she whispered. James's stomach nodded. "Searching for me?" The woman nodded, her eyes glistening. "I know what happened to you that night." A chill ran down his spine. James swallowed hard. "Who are you?" Tears welled up in the woman's eyes. She reached for his hand, her fingers ice cold. "My name is Eleanor," she said softly. "And I was there when you disappeared." James's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. His memories had always been fractured, scattered like broken pieces of glass. But something about her voice, her presence, stirred something deep inside him. She had been there. She knew. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Eleanor leaned in closer. "They took you," she whispered. "And they never wanted you to remember." The words sent a shiver through him. James gripped the table, his heartbeat thunderous in his ears. "Who?" he asked, barely able to breathe. "Who took me?" Eleanor glanced around as if afraid someone might be listening. Then, in a voice so low it was almost lost beneath the noise of the diner, she said. "They're still watching." James's breath hitched. His fingers clenched the newspaper clipping as he stared at Eleanor. "They're still watching." The words echoed in his mind, sending a cold shiver down his spine. His eyes darted around the diner, scanning the faces of customers, the sound of chatter and clinking dishes and now distant noise. "Who?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Who's watching?" Eleanor inhaled sharply, her frail hands trembling as she reached into her bag. She pulled out another folded piece of paper, this one newer, its edges crisp. She slid it toward him. James hesitated before unfolding it. His breath caught in his throat as he saw a photograph. It was him. Not as a child, but as he was now. A picture of him wiping down tables at the diner. Beneath the photo, a single line of text sent ice through his veins. Subject located. Observe, but do not engage, yet. James's hands shook. His stomach twisted as he looked back at Eleanor. "What is this?" "They've been keeping track of you," she said, her voice urgent. "They know exactly where you are." His mind raced. He had no family, no records before the age of 11. He had always wondered who he was before that, but he never expected this. Someone knew. Someone had been watching him all along. "Who are they?" James asked, his throat dry. Eleanor swallowed hard. "People who don't want the truth coming out. People who were involved the night you disappeared." James leaned in. "You said you were there. What did you see?" Eleanor hesitated, glancing around again before lowering her voice. "I was driving past that night. I saw the accident. Your parents' car was crushed, barely recognizable." Her voice broke slightly, but she continued. I stopped, thinking there were no survivors. But then I saw movement. You had crawled out of the wreckage. James felt like he couldn't breathe. He had always assumed someone had found him after the crash, but he had never known who. Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. You were hurt. You collapsed in the rain. I was about to call for help when a black van pulled up. 4 men got out. They weren't paramedics. No uniforms. No lights. James's heart pounded. They picked you up like a rag doll. You were barely conscious. Eleanor's eyes darkened. I knew something was wrong. I tried to follow them, but they disappeared into the storm. James's pulse roared in his ears. Who were they? Eleanor shook her head. I spent years trying to find out. I tracked the accident report, but it didn't match what I saw. The official story said you were never found. It was a lie. They covered it up. James's hands curled into fists. Why would they take me? Eleanor's expression turned grave. That's what I've been trying to figure out. She hesitated. But I do know one thing. James leaned forward. They never expected you to survive. A cold dread settled in his chest. Eleanor's fingers gripped the table. James, they let you go for a reason. Either they thought you were dead, or they wiped your memory so you'd never go looking for answers. James's mind swirled with questions. If these people had taken him, why had they left him in a hospital with no memory? Why had they let him live a normal life? Eleanor leaned in. The fact that you're here means something changed. Either you slipped through the cracks, or they're waiting for the right moment to take you back. James felt like the walls were closing in. Then what do we do? He asked. Eleanor reached into her bag again and pulled out something small. A USB drive. I've spent years collecting information, she said. I don't have all the answers, but this might help you find them. James took it with a shaky hand. Go home, she said. Look through it. But be careful. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Because if they know you're remembering, they'll come for you. James nodded slowly, slipping the USB into his pocket. He felt like a fuse had been lit inside him, one that could explode at any moment. But before he could leave, Eleanor's grip tightened on his wrist. There's one more thing, she said. Her voice was almost fearful now. James turned back. What? Eleanor's lips trembled. The men who took you that night. I think they knew your parents. James felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. His parents? The memory of their lifeless faces flashed in his mind. He had spent his whole life assuming they were ordinary people, victims of a tragic accident. But what if there was more? What do you mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor hesitated, then sighed. Look inside the USB. You'll understand. James swallowed hard, nodding. He turned toward the door, his heart racing. He needed to get out of here. He needed to see what was on that drive. But as he stepped outside, a chill ran down his spine. A black car sat parked across the street. Tinted windows. Engine running. James's pulse spiked. Were they watching him right now? Then, just as he took a step forward, the car's headlights flicked on. And it started moving. James's breath hitched as the black car rolled forward. His feet felt rooted to the pavement, his mind screaming at him to move. The car didn't speed up, it moved slow, deliberate, almost taunting. James turned sharply, forcing himself to walk, not run, toward the nearest alley. His instincts screamed that sudden movement would make him a target. But his heart hammered in his chest, his pulse roaring in his ears. Are they watching me? Have they been watching this whole time? He gripped the USB drive in his pocket like a lifeline. Eleanor's words echoed in his head. If they know you're remembering, they'll come for you. A gust of wind rushed past him as he turned the corner, stepping into the shadows of the narrow alleyway. He kept walking, quick but controlled. The streetlights barely reached between the buildings, casting eerie shapes on the brick walls. Behind him, the car slowed to a stop. James clenched his jaw. He needed to get out of sight, fast. A rusted fire escape hung just above him. Without thinking, he leaped, grabbing the cold metal bar and pulling himself up. His muscles burned as he scrambled onto the platform, flattening himself against the wall. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. Seconds later, footsteps echoed below. Not one pair, two. James's stomach twisted. They weren't just watching now. They were following. From his vantage point, he could see two figures dressed in dark clothes, moving methodically as they scanned the alley. One of them spoke into a small earpiece. Subject last seen entering this area. No visual yet. James squeezed his eyes shut. Subject. They weren't calling him by name. To them, he wasn't a person. He was an object. The second man stepped closer. His face was mostly hidden under a cap, but James could see a sharp jawline and an emotionless expression. He held something in his hand. A small device, blinking red. James's throat tightened. A tracker? The man adjusted the device, scanning the alley walls. Then his head tilted upward. James's heart stopped. The man whispered into his earpiece. Possible elevation. Checking rooftops. James didn't think. He moved. He gripped the railing and climbed higher, pulling himself onto the roof just as the man reached for the fire escape. James rolled onto his back, gasping for air. The rooftop was empty except for a few ventilation units and an old antenna. His mind raced. I need to get out of here. From below, he heard them climbing. James pushed himself up and sprinted across the rooftop. The city stretched ahead, rows of buildings, their rooftops uneven. A 10-foot gap separated this building from the next. No time to hesitate. James ran harder. His legs burned as he pushed off the edge, flying over the dark gap below. For a split second, he thought he wouldn't make it. Then his hands slammed against the opposite ledge. He gritted his teeth, using every ounce of strength to pull himself up. Behind him, a voice cursed. He's moving toward the east block. Keep eyes on him. James didn't stop. He kept running, his lungs on fire. Another alley. Another rooftop. He jumped again. His foot slipped slightly on landing, but he caught himself. The men weren't far behind. But then, a siren wailed in the distance. James's head snapped toward the street below. A patrol car turned onto the main road, its red and blue lights flashing. A chance. James spotted a metal ladder leading down the side of the building. He gripped it tightly and slid down, his palms burning from the friction. As soon as his feet hit the ground, he darted into the street, right into the path of the police car. The officer inside barely had time to brake. The window rolled down, and a stern voice called out. Hey! What the hell are you doing? James spun around. The two men on the rooftop had frozen. They weren't chasing anymore. They were watching. James turned back to the officer. I think I'm being followed. His voice shook, but his words were deliberate. The officer narrowed his eyes. By who? James hesitated. He had no proof. No names. But the men weren't moving anymore. They were melting into the shadows. Like they were never there at all. James swallowed hard. I don't know. The officer exhaled, looking James up and down. He seemed to be debating something. Finally, he said, "Where do you live? I'll drive you home." James nodded slowly, forcing himself to breathe. "Yeah. Home." But as he climbed into the car, one thought rattled through his mind. Home isn't safe anymore. James sat stiffly in the police car, his fingers tightening around the USB drive in his pocket. The officer glanced at him, then back at the road. The flashing lights had been turned off, but the quiet hum of the engine filled the tense silence. "You look shaken," the officer said, his voice level. "You sure you're okay?" James forced a nod. "Yeah, it's been a long night." The officer didn't seem convinced. "You said someone was following you." James hesitated. Telling the truth wouldn't help, he had no names, no proof, just a gut feeling that something was terribly wrong. And those men? They disappeared the moment the police showed up, like ghosts. It was probably nothing, he finally muttered. Just some guys in a car. I panicked. The officer exhaled, his grip tightening on the wheel. "You don't look like the type to panic." James didn't respond. His mind kept replaying everything, the newspaper clipping, Eleanor's warning, the two men tracking him like he was some target. "If they know you're remembering, they'll come for you." The streetlights cast long shadows as they turned onto his block. The apartment complex loomed ahead, dark except for a few scattered windows still glowing. The officer pulled up to the curb and parked. "You want me to walk you up?" James shook his head quickly. "No, I'm good. Thanks for the ride." The officer studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "All right. Just, be careful. Something tells me you're not telling me everything." James forced a small, grateful smile and stepped out, his heart pounding as he approached his building. The second the police car pulled away, the street felt eerily silent. His eyes darted around. No black car. No movement. But the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He hurried inside, locking the main door behind him, then took the stairs two at a time. Every shadow felt like it was hiding someone. His mind screamed at him to stay alert. Finally, he reached his apartment. He slid the key into the lock, but as he twisted it, a chill ran through him. The door wasn't fully closed. A tiny gap. Barely noticeable. Someone had been inside. His throat tightened. He stepped back, his pulse hammering in his ears. Forcing himself to stay calm, he pressed his back against the hallway wall, scanning for movement. The air felt wrong, too still. He took a slow breath, then pushed the door open just enough to see inside. Darkness. Silence. But something was different. His apartment wasn't trashed. Nothing was overturned, no broken glass, no signs of a struggle. It looked normal. But James knew better. The air smelled faintly of something, rubber, maybe? Like gloves. Someone had been here. But they hadn't been looking for valuables. They were looking for him. His grip tightened on the USB drive. It felt heavier now. Taking a careful step inside, he reached for the nearest light switch. And froze. A single object sat on his kitchen table. A cell phone. Not his. A small, cheap burner phone. A message displayed on the screen. One new text message. James's breath came faster. His gut screamed at him not to touch it. But he had no choice. With shaking fingers, he picked it up and opened the message. 4 words. You took what's ours. His stomach twisted. His skin went cold. His hands clenched around the phone as a new thought hit him. They didn't break in to steal anything. They left something behind. A warning. Or a trap. James turned sharply, rushing toward the window. He peered outside, scanning the street below. And there it was. A black car. Parked under a streetlight. Engine running. Watching. Waiting. James's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't random. It wasn't paranoia. He was being hunted. And now, there was no way out. James's grip tightened around the burner phone as he backed away from the window. His mind raced. Every part of him screamed to run, but where? His apartment was compromised. The black car outside confirmed it. They weren't just watching anymore, they were waiting. He needed to leave. Now. His hands shook as he shoved the phone into a drawer. The USB drive burned in his pocket. Is this what they want? A floorboard creaked. James froze. The sound hadn't come from outside. It came from inside the apartment. His breath caught in his throat. His mind replayed every detail. He hadn't checked every room. He'd assumed the intruder was gone. Slowly, he turned toward the hallway leading to his bedroom. The air felt heavier. The darkness stretched longer. Then, another creak. Someone was still here. James moved carefully, stepping around the kitchen counter. His eyes darted toward the knife block. He grabbed the largest one without a second thought. The cold handle steadied his trembling fingers. A shadow shifted under the bedroom door. His heart pounded. The door wasn't fully closed. It had been left open, just a crack. James took a silent breath, tightening his grip on the knife. He needed an advantage. If someone was in there, he couldn't let them know he was ready. His eyes flicked to the hallway light switch. A plan formed. His foot inched closer. Then, he lunged. His fingers slammed the switch. The hallway burst with light. At the same moment, James kicked the bedroom door wide open. Silence. The room was empty. The closet door stood slightly ajar. James swallowed hard. His pulse roared in his ears. He stepped forward, knife raised. His fingers curled around the closet handle. One breath. Two. Then, he yanked it open. Nothing. Just clothes hanging neatly. No sign of anyone. James exhaled sharply, his body sagging against the wall. His nerves were shot. He was seeing threats everywhere. But the sense of unease didn't fade. His instincts screamed at him. Something was still wrong. Then he saw it. His desk drawer, where he kept his passport, extra cash, and documents, was open. Not fully. Just enough. Someone had been searching. His stomach dropped. He rushed forward and yanked it open completely. His passport was gone. The cash was gone. Everything that could help him disappear, taken. Panic surged in his chest. He had nothing now. No ID. No way to book a flight or rent a car. They weren't just following him. They were trapping him. His mind raced. He needed a plan. He had to get out, but with no ID and no cash, his options were limited. His gaze snapped to his phone. He couldn't use it. If they had tracked his apartment, they could track his calls. Then the burner phone buzzed. James's stomach twisted. Another message. He picked it up with shaky fingers. You can't run. His breath hitched. A noise outside, a car door opening. They were coming. James acted on instinct. He grabbed his jacket, the USB drive, and stuffed the burner phone into his pocket. His eyes darted to the fire escape. It was his only chance. He rushed to the window, unlocked it, and slipped outside. The cold air hit him like a slap. The metal rungs of the fire escape groaned under his weight. He moved fast. Down one flight. Then another. A voice from the street below. He's moving. Take the back. James's heart stopped. They knew. They were waiting for him. But James wasn't stopping. He reached the second-floor landing and jumped. The ground slammed into him, pain jolting up his legs, but he didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the alley. Footsteps pounded behind him. They were chasing him. James didn't look back. He wasn't going to let them catch him. He had one goal now. Find Eleanor. She had answers. And she was the only person left he could trust. James's breath burned in his throat as he sprinted through the alley. His legs ached from the fall, but adrenaline kept him moving. Footsteps thundered behind him, closing in fast. He took a sharp turn into a side street, nearly slipping on the damp pavement. The city lights flickered ahead, freedom was close, but the men chasing him weren't giving up. A car screeched to a halt at the intersection. Headlights blinded him. James skidded to a stop. The black car. Two figures stepped out. Trapped. The footsteps behind him grew louder. His mind raced. There was no way out, unless... His eyes darted to the subway entrance a few feet away. It was his only shot. James lunged forward, ignoring the pain in his legs, and bolted down the stairs. The muffled roar of an incoming train filled his ears. If he could make it onto that train, he might just escape. He shoved past late-night commuters, leaping over the turnstile. Shouts echoed behind him. James didn't turn around. He sprinted down the platform as the train doors slid open. A hand grabbed the back of his jacket. James twisted violently, breaking free. He threw himself into the train just as the doors slammed shut. The last thing he saw through the window was a man in a dark suit staring at him, his jaw clenched. James's chest heaved as he stumbled to an empty seat. His body was trembling. But he was free. For now. The hidden message. The train rumbled forward. James forced himself to breathe. His hands trembled as he reached into his pocket, feeling the USB drive pressing against his palm. This is why they're after me. He needed to see what was on it. His phone was too risky. He needed a safe place. One name came to mind. Eleanor. She knew something. She had left that newspaper clipping for a reason. James pulled out the burner phone. He hesitated. Was she being watched too? Was this putting her in danger? There was no choice. He typed quickly. I need to see you. Now. A long pause. Then, the screen lit up. 24th and Holloway. Come alone. James exhaled. He had a destination. And hopefully, some answers. Meeting Eleanor. The train ride felt endless. Every time the doors opened, James tensed, expecting his pursuers. But no one came. At 24th and Holloway, he slipped into the shadows of the quiet street. The area was old, abandoned buildings, flickering streetlights, the scent of rain in the air. Eleanor hesitated. Then, she pulled out an old laptop from her bag. We'll check together. She plugged in the USB. The screen flickered. A single file appeared. Project Aegis, restricted access. James's stomach dropped. What the hell is this? Eleanor clicked it open. Rows of classified reports flooded the screen. Names, dates, locations, government files. One word stood out. James felt his blood turn to ice. His own name. Eleanor's breath hitched. James, this isn't just about them watching you. She turned the screen. Subject, James Carter, status, experiment terminated. No survivors. James's head spun. Experiment? Terminated? Nothing made sense. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. They didn't just find you, James. She looked at him, fear in her eyes. You were never supposed to be alive. James's pulse thundered in his ears. He stared at the words on the screen, his own name listed under experiment terminated. No survivors. What the hell does this mean? His voice was barely a whisper. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she scrolled through the files. Reports filled the screen, classified medical records, genetic sequencing charts, surveillance logs. Her voice was tense. James, this isn't just a government file. She pointed at a timestamp. This was written 7 years ago. James's breath caught. 7 years ago? That was the year he had been in a car accident. He had nearly died. Or at least, that's what he had been told. James's mind reeled. I don't understand. Eleanor swallowed hard. They didn't just track you, James. They created you. James staggered back. No. That's impossible. Eleanor clicked on another file. It was a video, grainy, black and white surveillance footage. A hospital room. A man lying unconscious in a hospital bed. Medical machines surrounded him. Doctors in hazmat suits moved around him. James's stomach twisted. The patient in the bed was him. He watched in horror as one of the doctors turned toward the camera. The badge on his suit read Project Aegis, lead researcher, Dr. Henry Lawson. The voice in the video was eerily calm. Subject James Carter, age 28. Experiment results inconclusive. Termination scheduled for March 18, 2018. March 18. That was the exact day James had woken up in the hospital after his accident. Or was it an accident at all? His hands clenched into fists. I was supposed to die that day. Eleanor nodded. And somehow, you survived. They must have lost track of you, until now. James's stomach turned. All these years, he had been living a life that wasn't supposed to exist. The final hunt. A sudden bang shattered the moment. The cafe window exploded, sending shards of glass flying. James tackled Eleanor to the ground as bullets tore through the walls. They had found him. Run. Eleanor grabbed the laptop and bolted toward the back exit. James followed, his heart pounding. More gunfire. Shouts from the street. A car engine roared to life. They burst into the alleyway. A black SUV screeched around the corner, blocking their escape. Doors flew open. 2 men in tactical gear stepped out, guns raised. A third man emerged slowly, his presence commanding. Dr. Henry Lawson. The man from the video. James's breath caught. He wasn't just a name on a file anymore. He was real. Lawson's voice was smooth. You've made quite a mess, James. James clenched his fists. What did you do to me? Lawson sighed. You were part of something bigger. A genetic experiment meant to push the boundaries of human evolution. But you weren't supposed to last this long. Eleanor's voice shook. You tried to kill him. Lawson's eyes darkened. We tried to correct an error. James's mind raced. They weren't here to talk. They were here to finish the job. He had one chance. James lunged for Eleanor's bag, grabbing the laptop. In one motion, he smashed it against the pavement. The hard drive cracked. The files, gone. Lawson's face hardened. James gritted his teeth. Now you have nothing. For the first time, Lawson hesitated. The proof of Project Aegis was gone. No records. No leverage. James took that moment to grab Eleanor's hand. They ran. Bullets tore past them as they zigzagged through the alley. James didn't stop. He didn't look back. The city swallowed them whole. One final message. Hours later, James and Eleanor sat in a dingy motel room, out of breath, exhausted. Eleanor rubbed her face. They won't stop looking. James exhaled. I know. But something was different now. For the first time, James wasn't running blindly. He knew the truth, who he was, why they wanted him gone. And if they thought they could erase him again, they were wrong. His phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. This isn't over. We will find you. James stared at the screen. Then, he smiled. He typed 2 words. Try me.